LSE is part of the Open Science and Scholarship Festival. Our topics of concern today are as follows. First, how the rise of populism and its attacks on the academy impact researchers and the open research movement. Second, whether researchers in that environment have an obligation to be open, and if so, how they can protect themselves. My name is Jason Alexander, a professor in the Department of Philosophy, Logic, and Scientific Method at the LSE, and I will be chairing the event. Today, we are fortunate to have three speakers, each of them leading visionaries in the world of open research, and all of them exceptionally qualified to speak on today's topic. Our first speaker, Sara Rouhi, brings a unique perspective through her combination of political science training and scholarly publishing expertise. Since 2008, she has transformed how knowledge is created and shared, currently driving strategic initiatives at AIP Publishing to develop new publishing models that accelerate researcher-focused open science. Her career spans leadership roles at influential organizations, including Public Library of Science, where she developed innovative approaches to open access publishing, and Altmetric, where she helped reshape research impact measurement. Most relevant to today's discussion is her recent co-authorship of the 2025 declaration to #Defend Research from U.S. government censorship, demonstrating her commitment to protecting scientific research integrity in an increasingly politicized environment. Our second speaker, Martin Paul Eve, brings an extraordinary interdisciplinary perspective as both a leading scholar of literature and technology and one of the most influential advocates for open access in higher education. Currently a professor at Birkbeck and technical lead at Mesh Research, his work bridges humanities and technological innovation in scholarly publishing. Martin's impact on open access policy has been transformative across the UK and internationally, appearing before the UK House of Commons Select Committee inquiry into open access, and serving on numerous influential committees. As a Plan S ambassador and co-founder of the Open Library of Humanities, he has advanced sustainable models for open scholarship, earning recognition as one of the 5 finalists for The Guardian's 2017 award for higher education's most inspiring leader and a recipient of the Association of University Presses Stand Up Award in 2024. Our third speaker, Francis Pinter, brings unparalleled experience through her 5-decade career spanning entrepreneurial publishing, international development, and open source innovation. At 23, she became the first woman to establish her own publishing company, Pinter Publishers, in the UK, later working with George Soros to devise multi-million-dollar programs supporting publishing in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union after the fall of communism, positioning her at the forefront of using publishing for democratic transformation. Her founding of Knowledge Unlatched in 2012 revolutionized sustainable open access models. Most relevant to today's theme, she recently launched another multi-million-dollar campaign to make climate science open access and established the organization SUPER, which stands for Supporting Ukrainian Publishing Resilience and Recovery, demonstrating her commitment to protecting scholarly freedom even in the face of authoritarian threats. Our plan this afternoon is as follows. Each of our speakers will have approximately 10 minutes to convey their thoughts, and then we will open it up to questions from the online audience. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A, and we will try to respond to as many as possible. And do please note that today's event will be recorded and shared online at a later point. And now, please join me in giving a warm online welcome to our first speaker, Sara Rouhi.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me and see my slides okay? All right. All right, fantastic. Thank you so much for that generous and kind introduction, Jason. It is a big honor to join Martin and Francis on such an august panel. So thank you for having me. My name is Sara Rouhi. I'm the co-author, on the Declaration to Defend Research from U.S. government censorship. I've been in scholarly communications, working at both software and publishing houses, focusing in open access and open science in the STEM fields, but my background is in political science, political theory, so I bring kind of a humanist lens to some of this work. I'm an advocate very much of sustainable, pragmatic open science, so not open science for its own sake, but rather as a means to an end. And I come to the activism work as a naturalized US citizen and immigrant, and someone who feels very privileged to participate in the American experiment. And so the free speech work is very much a core thing that I think we need to defend now more than ever. So my co-authors on the declaration, you'll notice here we're all sharing our org IDs.
Sarah, we've lost your slides. It's just showing us loading.
Oh, let's try again. Let's see. How about now? Oh, screen sharing is paused. Why is that? Stop share. All right, let's start over. You can check that off of your Zoom bingo that we messed that up. Let's try it again. Okay. Here we go. How about that?
Yeah.
Better? Working? All right, perfect. So my colleagues, we all work at nonprofits that can't publicly endorse what we do. So we're all doing this work on our own. But you can see from our backgrounds as different stakeholders in scholarly communications that the issue of censorship is particularly front and center for us. And we're highlighting that amidst all of the madness because it's such a foundational first step in erasing, particularly in science. Censorship of science is key to erasing communities and making policy decisions that erase individuals and communities. So we're choosing to focus on this particular action, and we encourage every slide here has a link to the declaration. Please consider reading it, signing it, joining us in these 4 acts of resistance, and certainly get in touch if you have questions about any of that. So I like to start conversations around censorship by quoting Ai Weiwei, both as an artist and a dissident. He has a really a unique way of sort of getting at the paradox of some of these challenges. And what he's essentially getting at here, right, is democratization, not just of information, but of communication, can help bring down oppressive governments. If you're in Tahrir Square and you're organizing via Twitter, next thing you know, you have the Arab Spring. Conversely, you also can bring down apparently American democracy in similar ways, potentially. And so the co-optation of language, the elimination of certain language, and the elevation of other kinds of language, these are all power mechanisms that are much, much easier to use and to weaponize given how easy and unsiloed it is to access and spread information. So the natural, sorry, and I should say, because we live in the worst timeline possible, there are just a lot of terrible GIFs in this slide, so in this deck, so please forgive me in advance. But one of the key questions that came to us post election was, this is an anti-intellectual, anti-elite movement. Surely the approach to science and open science will be walked back. Certainly none of this will be valued. Especially if you view open science as a progressive goal. And I would argue post the 2021 recommendation on open science from UNESCO, the movement to enable and include as many people in the process and benefits of science does code very much on the left. So if you take the view that this administration is anti-establishment, anti-intellectual, and that open science codes left, then it's very easy to think that this administration would not support that. However, if you actually see what scientists, not propagandists, but scientists in the administration say about what their goals are for science, they're pretty middle of the road. They're pretty, they're nothing that I would disagree with. Certainly they have their hobby horses, but these views, many would agree with, irrespective of your partisan allegiances. And so what I was thinking about, all right, how do we think about what this administration would want to do with respect to open science? Let's look at the work of the current head of the NIH, who is, the head of the largest funding organization on the planet, and see if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck. So I went to the journal, the Academy of Public Health, which is a journal Jay Bhattacharya launched in January of this year, through funding by the Real Clear Foundation, which is a partisan foundation, and looked at what is the publishing philosophy and scientific kind of philosophy of science around their work. And as an open science advocate, this checked all the boxes for me. Immediate open access, CCBY, open peer review, not just reviewer recognition, but also compensation. So reviewers receive honoraria for their work, and timely and efficient publication that doesn't quite get to preprints, but really pushes for reducing gatekeeping to access to research. So it looks like a duck. When you look at one of the very first editorials, it speaks to a personal bugbear of mine. I think the role of journals, particularly a very small group of prestige journals who kind of set the definition for what good science is deeply problematic. So again, it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck to me, but I don't know if it's a duck. And this is something I think we have to think about as we move into this new space where science is increasingly a partisan exercise. So if you go to the homepage of this journal, and I encourage everyone to do so, you'll see very clearly there is an angle that this community is pushing. All of the research pushes back really hard on the orthodoxy around mask mandates, vaccine mandates, and school closures. Now, it's all open. It does not mean that the research isn't robust or rigorous. The peer reviews are open. My understanding from people who work in the space is that the research is sound, but it does, go after a certain set of orthodoxies that these folks felt were shut down during COVID. So my question then is, are we in a horseshoe in terms of the pushing for open science by quote unquote both sides? So what is a horseshoe? If you're familiar with folks who work, who study conspiracy theories and fringe groups, the horseshoe theory is the idea that politics doesn't exist on a spectrum, but rather it's U-shaped. The far, far left and far, far right often come to the same conclusions about how the world should be, but through very different paths. So a classic example of this is, getting rid of the government, overthrowing the government. A leftist anarchist and a far right militia member prepper, living in the hills of Idaho, both probably want to overthrow the government or get rid of it, but they get there through very, very different paths. You see this with other extremist views ranging from anti-Semitism to anti-vax. There's a lot of these things, but as you look at these movements, it's a very compelling argument. So if we were to look at open science in this way, what does it mean that, the UNESCO progressive definition and now the definition of this administration, especially post-executive order on gold standard open science, what do those two kind of paths to open science look like? So a good faith take, the take that I would argue myself, is that science does very much have a calcified establishment, a clique that's based on black box approaches to how science is disseminated, how it's vetted, who gets rewarded, who doesn't. There's not a lot of room for heterodoxy. I would argue open science is really important to getting back to what science is quote unquote really about. So if you were to take the good faith arguments around this, I think they would look like the column on the left. The more cynical view, and I have the little horse there because the cynical view is right that open science is effectively a Trojan horse to enable a bunch of other things, right? Taking the fruits of many, many years of government investment and then privatizing them to monetize them. We have to feed our hungry machines. Once we've stolen all of the US government data, we still need to feed these LLMs. And so openness gives us more food. But all of this, the cynical view is that open science gives us a mechanism to make science and science policy basically an extension of a partisan strategy, which is very problematic. And so let me see how much time. Oh, I'm close. Okay. So where does the horseshoe leave us, right? If both ends of it push for, research should be immediately open, reviewers should be known, their reviews should be public, there should be the ability to publicly engage with real time, not just with the paper and the reviews, but the data and the code and whatever else went into making that object. Is that a good thing? Is the propagation of those practices valuable, even if what gets us there is bad faith? If we get to those best practices, but eliminate and erase entire fields and communities of science and areas of inquiry, is that worth it? I would argue it probably isn't. But when we come out the other side, because nothing lasts forever, will the fact that these practices have been deeply instantiated actually enable us to get back to the thing that both sides claim they want, which is what science is really about? And so I leave everyone, and certainly I think this will be interesting in light of Martin and Francis's commentary, I leave you with kind of my personal definition of science, which is sort of synthesized by Walter Kaufmann, who is the kind of preeminent scholar of Nietzsche, on Nietzsche's philosophy of science, which is fundamentally that science is not a finished and impersonal system, but a passionate quest for knowledge, an unceasing series of courageous experiments that are small, that are not glamorous, that will not necessarily get you a bunch of prestige and recognition, but are fundamentally about answering questions about understanding our world. So posing more questions than answers, but really excited to have a conversation today. Please do take a look at the declaration, and I look forward to the conversation.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Sara, for that fascinating and stimulating talk. And now let us turn it over to our second speaker, Martin Pauly. Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me here today. I'm afraid I have no exciting slides like Sara, but nonetheless, I hope this is of interest. I thought before I started that we actually don't have a definition of populism and what we're dealing with today, and we might all have different ideas about what that actually means. So I went back to basics and just thought I'd set out what I think of with that term, how I define it and what it means for me. And then I want to delve into what I think that means for the open science movement, perhaps taking more of the cynical side of the argument than Sara. So populism is a contested concept. I mean, it sounds like it could just be democracy doing what people want, but it's used to refer to a variety of political stances that emphasize this idea of the common people, the idea that there is a mass who are underspoken in democratic systems, and this group of leaders who are populist position themselves in opposition to a perceived elite and perceived political system. So it's frequently associated with anti-establishment and anti-political sentiment, even while its advocates are usually politicians who are very establishment in themselves. I also take it that there is a sort of authoritarian streak running through these governments, and we might see them at the moment in the United States, as Sara implied. We might see them in Israel. We might see them in Russia. You know, there's going to be contested definitions of where we see these leaders emerging in the world at the moment. But there's also the rise of the right in Europe that might be populist if it got there. But anyway, we have these governments of a certain authoritarian streak. And as Sara said, we're trying to work out what that means for the open science movement. Open access scholarly publishing seems to present a set of solutions to authoritarian populism through the dissemination of open knowledge and a theme of disinfectant through sunlight. The argument seems to be that if you can make knowledge openly accessible, people will be better educated, and it must be a lack of education in some way that is leading them to vote for these damaging parties, damaging to their own interests certainly, but damaging to everybody else's as well. And you know, just open access to knowledge will help with that. And I think that's quite a problematic argument to underpin what's going on here. I think it's not particularly fair to brand huge portions of our population as undereducated, and that's a democratic deficit. But sometimes that can be the argument that's subconsciously sneaking through here when we say, if we make more information available, people will vote differently. But open access in the current moment obviously faces several threats from authoritarian populism. Now, I'm not saying this is direct in perhaps the way that Sara was exploring and looking at those in power who are doing it, but more thinking about the chilling effects that I'm seeing running through various venues. So, for example, a genuine Blue Sky post from a few days ago here, paraphrased, was, "I don't mind there being a paywall on my journal because in these hard current times, journals need a way to survive economically, and scholars need a safe space to be able to discuss intellectually their work." So what's going on in that argument is that people are saying a paywall acts as a shield from government direct intervention. It keeps people out just by the nature of having to pay and then believing that government will not pay, and so they will not be found. And this is seen as the way that scholars will continue to be able to discuss their research in a way that doesn't get them in trouble for pursuing the aspects that they want to pursue. So I think that's quite challenging and problematic for an open science movement that you can go underground because you're behind a paywall, and that people would feel the need and want to do so. We've spent almost three decades arguing that the greatest good from scholarship is done when as many people as possible can access it without paywalls sitting in the way. But then for people to turn this around and say, actually, in this time, we need an underground space that's hidden by a paywall. That also obviously excludes those who are unable to pay for scholarship. It excludes conversations on a global nature, with, say, between the global north and south, thinking about what researchers' collaborative global practice should look like in that world, all in the name of trying to avoid populist government incursion into open science and open research practices. But I want to also talk about another phenomenon that's come along recently, and that was also mentioned in the last talk, which is the rise of AI and LLMs, and what that means for open science, and what it means that it's coincident with the rise of authoritarian populism in politics. So Sara was talking about the horseshoe theory of open science politics, and what you might get, and a good critique of that particular stance. I wonder, though, whether actually we've always had a very heterodox set of political motivations behind the phrase open access movement, and it is not a homogenous movement with unified goals, aims, and methods. For example, we have a very left spectrum take on open access publishing that is about that global social justice angle. It's about ensuring the right to read regardless of whether you can pay. It might also be about demolishing the profits of large publishing corporations like Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, Wiley, and so on, and anger at the level of profit making in a sector where many people cannot afford the end product. On the other hand, you also have a set of arguments that lean further right into neoliberal transparency discourses around open access and open access movement practices. So, for example, saying taxpayer-funded research should be available to people who pay tax is a very common trope of neoliberal public accountancy expenditure discourse. Can you be accountable for how you've spent tax discourse, and are the fruits of that tax spending going back to the people who paid it? Because taxation should only be used for certain very limited purposes in these kinds of political philosophies. So is it rational to think that everybody in the open access movement would have the same endpoint goals, even though they profess that open access as some unified phenomenon is what they're aiming for, when actually they could come from very, very different political stances towards what that's supposed to achieve, why they're doing it, and so on? I mean, there might even be people out there who think that the goal of open access should be for private corporations to be able to benefit from that work without giving back, because they paid it for it in taxpayer funding in the first place. So, that's a very different stance to what you get from a very left perspective on open access. But one of the things that open access has always had as part of its principles is the reuse of material through Creative Commons licenses. And again, different people on the political spectrum of open access advocacy will have different views on which open license is actually appropriate. Some want a non-commercial license, others want purely a reuse license with attribution, and it varies. But what we have seen in recent days is the outcome of something we always argued for in open access, which was text and data mining reuse. LLMs, large language models that synthesize huge volumes of text and manage to regurgitate it in natural language to humans when asked, rephrasing and rejigging what they've got in their model, is actually the ultimate outcome of text and data mining. And a lot of people are not very happy about this at all. It's a massive chilling effect on scholarship, where people are again saying, the way that I can hide my work from these machines that ingest this work is to put a paywall in front of it so they can't get it. Now, that's actually nonsense, because the people training these models have used pirated copies of papers and pirated copies of books anyway. So putting a paywall in front of it won't do that, but it's perceived as another way of hiding work from large language models, corporate privatization, but also the immiseration of higher education. There's a study last week of teachers who said that Their lives were being wrecked by LLMs and having to provide feedback to machines rather than to human beings, and that this was not why they went into teaching, not what they wanted to do. And so we come to a problematic stance where I feel, in the light of authoritarian populism and the rise of LLMs and what that means at the same time, that our arguments for open access have come to fruition, but people really don't like them. They don't like the exposure that you get from doing your work in public. They don't like the exposure you get from having your work ingested into an LLM that then makes your marking job impossible. And I'm just asking whether this is the time when we need to reappraise what the open access movement is arguing for and rethink from a solid political grounding what we want to see from open science and open research practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin, for that wonderful talk and those really interesting comments and questions. So let's now turn to our third speaker, Francis Pinter, to get her thoughts on the subject. Francis, over to you.
Thank you very much, and delighted to be on this panel with my distinguished colleagues. Great to see you again. So I'm going to talk about open data. Specifically, I'd like to address the final questions raised in the session description. What are the responsibilities of individual researchers and institutions to be open? And how can you protect yourself when making your research openly available? And all this at a time when scholars and scientists are losing power and influence in our new world order. So what should we do and what can we do? Well, firstly, we need to be vigilant. Secondly, we need to understand the different circumstances in countries facing different challenges. And third, we need to build some new coalitions. I just got back a couple of days ago from Kyiv, where I was attending the country's largest book festival called Book Arsenal. This is a cross between Hay-on-Wye and the London Book Fair. Originally a 16th century monastery for women, and then rebuilt in the early 19th century arsenal to make ammunitions and cannons. And now this venue is a major cultural place that people come to. Now, the Ukrainian road to open access took twists and turns that were born out of necessity. There was never enough money to set up the ecosystem of closed academic publications to be sold through established networks to well-funded libraries. Books and journals were printed by university presses, that were just departments of universities, that served the publishing needs of the parent university. Circulation was low. Digitization, when it came, was a godsend, as costs of distribution could be reduced. Open access was thought to be even better. Of course, we all know that just reaching the target audience is not quite so easy. Nevertheless, Ukraine has now some 480 journals available as open access, mostly on OGA's platform and listed in DOAJ. Ukraine ranks 13th globally in terms of numbers of scientific publications listed in DOAJ. They're quite an output. But wartime conditions bring with it some unusual challenges. A few months ago, some Ukrainian legal scholars came to me with the following. They said the Russians have stolen the journals that were being published out of the displaced universities of Ukraine. These are the universities that were located in the Russian-occupied territories and now temporarily housed in other parts of the country. Stolen? Scholarly journals? Stolen, I said. How could this be? Well, the Russians had appropriated the ISSNs, the Individual International Standard Serial Numbers. They recreated the look and feel of the journal, using the same titles, and are pretending that these are the legitimate continuation of the publication of these universities. These are now being filled with mis- and disinformation. Meanwhile, the true owners of the journals are continuing to publish their editions with the same ISSNs as before. You can imagine this is leading to confusion. Which version is which? Well, we took the case to the ISSN International Center in Paris, the intergovernmental organization that regulates ISSNs, and they sorted out a technical fix that identifies which journal is which. This is a small win for Ukraine on the battlefield of digital metadata, but they thought it was important enough to them that I was invited to speak about it at a panel at Book Arsenal. And now this solution is being applied to other parts of the world with disputed territories. While I was in Kyiv, I met Professor Jana Shikovich of the University of Bredensk. This is very near Mariupol, one of the dislocated universities. Her area of work is in material sciences. She loves open access, but she's developing new materials for drones. Her data clearly needs to stay closed. Jana is also a social scientist, and she conducts her research on how academic researchers from the occupied territories are surviving the war. This includes people who have chosen to stay put and those who are now scattered all over Ukraine and Europe. She told me of what might happen if the personal data of these people got into the hands of the Russians. So how do we step up when the dangers to individuals are very real? Ukraine may be an extreme case, but there are issues much closer to home. We really need to recognize that as open as possible and as closed as necessary means different things to different people and must be both locally specific and internationally understood. And all of this within the context of varying national laws regulating privacy and data protection. And then there's the intimidation going on in the United States. One small example, AI is being used to track down civil society DEI offenders. And Trump's administration looks not only at what unfriendly activists are saying now, but also tracking deletions from their sites that they did even before the official investigations began. So how should we respond to all of this? It's dangerous. My answer, though far from complete, is take refuge in the safety of numbers and protect one another. Not everyone can stand up and fight alone. We need coalitions of organizations. Unite as never before. Join in on the kinds of things that Sara's doing and others. Form new coalitions with unlikely new friends. This is easier said than done, I know. Recently, I heard a suggestion that U.S. veterans might be good allies for our cause. After all, so many are grateful for the education they received after returning from overseas battle postings. Yet just this week, The Guardian reported that senior officials at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs have ordered that Veteran Affairs physicians and scientists not publish in medical journals or speak with the public without first seeking clearance from political appointees of Donald Trump. This is no small matter. Funded by Congress with nearly $1 billion annually, Veteran Affairs scientists operate in 102 research sites, and they're engaged in 7,300 ongoing projects, and they publish more than 10,000 papers in scientific journals each year. They're being gagged, their jobs are at risk, and they're being disparaged by the administration. In these circumstances, it's really tempting to withdraw into one's own shell or just complain. But as Timothy Snyder said, he's a well-known historian of Eastern Europe, do not dismiss people because you don't like them. When we behave dismissively, we behave like Trump. If we just carp over their behavior, they'll just continue to walk roughshod over our values. So how is all this relevant to us? Well, frankly, we need to put aside all the petty bickerings about the minute details of specific OA models. We need to join up and stand together against the attacks coming from governments, from big business, and from our enemies. Find the common denominators, find the new friends wherever they are, and then let's fight this together. Otherwise, there won't be much left worth making open access. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis, for that absolutely wonderful talk, dealing with a very sensitive and troubling subject. So to the audience who's been listening, please join me in thanking all three of our speakers for their wonderful talks and presentations. And please take some time now to think of questions that you can put in the Q&A that we can then begin to present to our speakers. As the audience is thinking about which questions they'd like to ask, let me begin with a question kind of presented generally to all three of you. In listening to what you've said, I was wondering about the following. Is it the case that the degree of openness that was initially envisioned in open access, open research, and open data, was that an unrealistic ideal predicated on the assumption that we were only dealing with good faith actors within an idealized academy environment? And now that we've actually seen what happens when open research and open data is realized on a fairly wide scale, wide reach case in an environment where there are bad actors, does that mean that we need to reconceive of the degree of openness in open research and open data? Or is the current model basically sustainable with some guardrails put in place? I don't have any answers. I'm hoping the three of you might have some suggestions.
Well, I'm sure Martin and Sara have better answers to this than I do. But I would say we need to possibly reinterpret what it means to keep data and research findings as open as possible and as closed as necessary. That is a moving feast, and we need to look at that carefully.
I mean,
Oh,
I
sorry.
was thinking back to various genocides of archive that I've seen written about, and the dangers of doing research under those types of conditions. It was a fantastic piece, and I'm really struggling to remember the name of the author now, which is a pain. But this was an example of what Francis was talking about as open as possible and as closed as necessary, where under those conditions, it was absolutely necessary there was some openness to call to account those who had perpetrated these genocides, while also thinking about the anonymity of authors, the anonymity of people named within those, and a purely, broad brush approach to this should all be open and available to everybody would just have led to a hideous political mess and danger to the people who were involved. And that's the kind of environment that we see emerging now. What concerns me is that people think that publishing behind a paywall is somehow a protection, and that publishing openly is different to that. If something is dangerous to publish and will endanger people or participants or authors, you shouldn't put it behind a paywall either. It's not going to save you. And this is the case where we need this kind of judgment about what we're making open, what is the level of protection you've got on it, and really does a paywall serve as any kind of protection from a government that has such power over you and could inflict such damage?
So Martin, if I can just ask a quick follow-up then. So what that would suggest is that open research effectively acts as an accelerator for dangers that have always existed since the printing press and before. It just doesn't create new dangers in kind. It makes it more easy for bad actors and governments, etc., to be able to track people down for their views and be able to take action as they wish.
I think so. I mean, I don't think, it's very easy to talk of the digital divide as this sudden break in the epistemology of how work is disseminated. And it is very different. It is global and it is instant and it is reproducible. And there are things that are different there. But it is also, as you say, a continuity. And it's still doing the same function of disseminating research. And just because we had different cost models in the past to what we might see in the digital era, it doesn't mean that they're not doing the same thing and that people can't get round that if they wanted to and couldn't look in your safe enclave away under the paywall. So yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it.
All right, fantastic. Sara, can I?
Well, I have to respond. I was like, Martin, please send me this Blue Sky post now. It's just going to make my head explode, but I still want to read it. I think what's really disconcerting about that post is it reflects like a very fundamental misunderstanding of how people get to things, and that the power of paywalls is not what this person is hoping for. So that I just had to get that head explode moment out there. With respect to the original question, Jason, I think part of the reason that all of this feels very disorienting is because open access, as I understand it, and I look to my fellow panelists in the audience to clarify if I'm wrong here, became a very ideological position, right? It became a moral piece. And so the advocacy for it always became very, very extreme and very, very coded in the right thing or the wrong thing. And so it was never treated as a tool, but as a value in and of itself. And one of the things I've been really wrestling with and thinking about open science generally is I don't think open for its own sake is inherently good or should inherently be the goal. And because the community never wanted to have that conversation of for what, I mean, I think the open data mandates that we are seeing now are a very good example of this. For what, for whom, and how. We got into this ideological place where nobody wanted to take the time to look at unforeseen consequences. And I would argue some of the consequences have been quite negative. So that's my thought about that.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So we've got a couple of questions from the audience, and so let me turn to these now. So there's one question which is addressed to all three speakers, and it is, as practitioners in open publishing, where do you see the future of open publishing headed? And in particular, what makes you optimistic about the future? Right. So can we maybe turn to Francis, Martin, and Sara then, please? So Francis.
Well, I'd like to think that we can be optimistic because I can see what young scholars and scientists are wanting to see happen with their work. They want to see impact, and they can see that with open access, they can have that impact. And so it would be for them to build the guardrails and to figure out how to get to what they need to achieve. So I think, of course, there's a whole debate over how one assesses the impact and who are the assessors and by what means and what incentives there are for early career academics, and all of that comes into the pot. But basically, we're seeing some very positive results that make it worth trying to get this right. And I agree with Sara, getting rid of the whole ideological debates that are going on. That's kind of what I was trying to say in my last few sentences. We got to get beyond that because it's wasting a lot of time and energy. And meanwhile, there's a bigger battle going on.
All right, thank you for that, Francis. Martin, can I get your thoughts on the future of open publishing and what makes you optimistic?
Yeah, I'm trying quite hard to be optimistic in a challenging situation. I mean, Francis has hit on something, which is the kind of joy that I see when somebody has a successful experience publishing openly and they suddenly get it and realize what it means. And every time that happens, I feel great. I feel somebody has seen what this can do, what its purpose is. But it's very easy then to dive into a social media swamp of people who have never done it, don't ever want to do it, and will defend to the hilt the existing system of closing things away behind paywalls. And you know, it's quite a dispiriting environment in many ways that it's taken us so many years to get to the point where these individual success stories can take us a step forward. But then you know, for every one of those I see, somebody drags me back. So I have very mixed thoughts about the success of what we've argued so far, and I guess that's why in my initial talk I closed with this idea that we need a very concrete, and I guess unified is a good way of putting it, you know, as Francis was gesturing towards, concept of what we want, and that everybody who is advocating for open access can get behind and support in a way without these petty differences in the very minute politics of open access and what's going on. It's going to be quite hard to do that though, and I think to get that unification. But you know, I don't think it's open access publishing is going to stop as a result of the threats from authoritarian populism. I think we will see a massive slowdown in research publishing in general, which could lead to economic tremors throughout the entire scholarly publishing industry. You know, if the largest research funders in the world are severely collapsed, is there still going to be enough flow for the economic models through the publishers to sustain them economically, is an interesting question. And will the open access publishers suffer worse than those that are not? But those are quite complex economic questions that result from this, and definitely not the ones that would make me particularly optimistic.
All right, thank you very much. Sara?
So my optimism is the optimism of an accelerationist. So take that for what you will. Many of the critiques of the current scientific establishment, I'm actually very, very on board with. And so I tend to think of this moment as chemo. If chemo doesn't kill the patient, I think, and it could, so I don't say that lightly. But I think, you know, many of the voices that are speaking out so loudly against what's happening now are absolutely in good faith, you know, viewing this as attacks on freedom of inquiry and freedom of speech. And that's all true. But many, many, many of those voices are deeply, deeply invested in a system that benefits them, whether it is their compensation, whether it's their prestige, whether it's their status. And so the tumbling down or the rectifying or the reforming of many of these practices, whether it's how you're funded, it's how you're published, it's how you're rewarded or recognized, right? Those sit with a small group that really love their power and really love their privilege and recognize that all of these paradigm shifts are going to jeopardize that. And so the acceleration in me is like, let's go towards that world as quickly as possible, because I don't know that you're going to get research assessment reform done in my lifetime if there isn't some kind of acute crisis that forces that. I don't know that we're going to get better at making the global North inclusive and recognizing of the impact it's had on global South research. I don't know that any of those things happen quickly given the inertia in the system. And so that's the tiny acceleration part in me says, experience an acute crisis and see how we come out the other side, recognizing that we may all be out of jobs in that world. But I think there's the silver lining is the patient might survive, and if it does, what comes out the other end, I think is probably healthier. But that's a dark positive take. So.
All right, thank you very much for that. So let's take another question. And so this one asks, is there a degree to which researchers need to consider the potential oppressive uses of open data for future authoritarian governments, rather than just in present political situations when deciding whether it'd be safe for it to be open? How can researchers draw the open-close line when thinking about possible political futures in that way? I think that's a really interesting question, because it's one thing to contend with the current known threats, but then it's another thing entirely to try to anticipate unknown threats and what might be considered of risk or of danger in the future. So let me begin with Francis, since your talk was on open data for the most part. So what are your thoughts?
I don't quite know how to answer that one. It's very much a personal view, whether people are wanting to take those kinds of risks with the future. They're unknown unknowns, many more unknown unknowns than we've ever had to face in the past. And I guess everybody has to take their own decisions on this. It kind of depends on where you are. I mean, for example, if you happen to be in one of the borderline countries around Eastern Europe, or you happen to be in Hungary, for instance, what kind of decision are you going to take for yourself? And how are you going to protect yourself? Some people I know are taking financial precautions by making sure that even though they're being controversial and letting their opinions be known, they're putting their financial assets in the name of their spouses in order to protect themselves should the governments come after them. So it kind of depends on where you are and how you feel and what is at stake for you personally.
So Sarah, would you like to comment on this?
Well, I actually want to counter Francis and say I think you answered it by your call to action at the end of your talk, which is I don't think researchers have realized how important it is for them to aggregate as a community around these questions. I mean, I'm on about 3 different Signal chats of hundreds of researchers in different fields talking about how are we going to protect each other, how are we going to protect the vulnerable, and they're making decisions and organizing, for lack of a better word. So doing exactly what you suggested, which is engaging in a way that recognizes there's a world outside our like tiny little niche area, and thinking more cohesively about how we work together to protect ourselves, whatever that behavior is. So that would be my recommendation.
All right, thanks for that. Martin, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, if it's really we're talking about a future situation that cannot be foreseen from the present, then there is no way that you can know whether or not what you're doing is going to cause danger to anybody, or how it's going to be used. What you can do is foresee what has happened in the past. We can learn from history, and we can see what's happening in the present, and we can guard against those situations and those historical situations repeating. And that might be good enough. Perhaps it is true that history just repeats itself again and again. But if we're really talking about completely different political situations beyond any kind of anticipation, then I agree with Francis. This is a very difficult situation to guard against, and you can't do it.
No, wait a minute. I'm not saying you can't. You can't guard against it because you can't know it completely, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be active.
You should try to
You
anticipate
should
a world,
try.
but
Keep
yeah.
trying. Keep trying. As I said in my talk, but it's and I guess I come back to it having just come back from Ukraine. Not just Ukraine, but I know Russian dissidents whose lives have been in danger because of what they said, etc. So how much risk is a person, an individual, willing to take? And that is quite different from what happens when a whole group comes together and the group gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's where this organizing and cross-cutting across the various areas of academia should be coming together, and beyond academia. I mean, I would recommend that we get together with kind of every kind of civil society organization that would have a stake in having a world where research is open for them to use in whatever way they wish.
Jason, can I jump onto that for a second?
Of course you can.
So I'm just rereading Thomas's question, and one of the things that strikes me about it, and I'm just seeing everywhere when talking particularly to researchers, is everything's very reactive, right? Like, what do we do to protect ourselves? What do we do to protect our funding, to protect our research areas? And I think the academic community needs to start really taking a proactive approach to communicating the value of what they do, right? The people going out in the streets to stand up for science in the US are not the general public, right? They are scientists and they are people who have been immediately impacted by science. And they understand that as my mom was going to die, but she got into a clinical trial and now she's going to be okay, right? They don't take out their phone and go science. They don't open their water taps and go science, right? They don't see an immediate impact. And the research community has never prioritized this. There's been an arrogance of assuming this is implicit, the good of what we do. And that has got to stop. It has got to be proactive on the part of these communities. And I'm, in my Signal chats, I'm starting to hear researchers think like that, but that has to be something that starts, at the undergraduate and graduate level to move out of that defensive or reactive posture.
Yeah, Sarah, thanks for that. I think that's a really good observation, and that is a many-year solution, because that is thinking that way is just not something which is part of the training or preparation of so many scientific researchers, right? I mean, that's not something that was ever even broached as a topic of concern back when I was a PhD student. So it's going to take a while to actually deeply embed that into the development of PhD programs in the future. Let me turn to another one of the questions from the Q&A. So someone asks, interestingly, about the extent to which the current environment might be exercising a more subtle effect on what kind of questions get asked or investigated in the first place. So the person asks, to what extent is ideological polarization or censorship likely to limit what science research even happens, let alone whether it's open? So this is not just in the US context, Russia or Hungary, the UK and elsewhere. And I would also maybe add to that, there's an interesting tension that this places researchers in who are deeply committed to open research, open data on moral or political grounds as a way of trying to help people who don't have access to the same kind of journals and elsewhere. Because if you are concerned about the current ideological polarization and censorship environment, might you just subconsciously or even deliberately start to self-select different questions for investigation, given that you are committed to open access? And so the actual kind of conduct of science, the investigation of science, ends up being steered in a way without even having to exercise any explicit political authority. So I'm not sure which one of you three would be most naturally placed to answer that. I think all of you. So could I ask her for a volunteer, please?
I'm happy to answer it, but I've definitely spoken too much. So I want to give Martin
Go
and
for it. I
Francis.
think everyone's
Well,
spoken
I
approximately
think
equal amounts. So let's go to Sarah and then Francis. All right. So
I mean, I would flag that this happens already, right? Every administration in the government funding space has priorities, and those drive what gets funded, and people absolutely pivot what they pursue based on that. They also pivot what they pursue based on what's going to get them rewards and recognition, which includes grant funding. So this is, a problem to begin with. I mean, I recall a researcher who works in maternal health complaining to me about the Gates Foundation, right? You have private funders who have like a personal hobby horse of something that they want to fund. They put, billions of dollars into funding it, but that's not the thing that actually needs to be researched, right? So I think this is always a problem. It's going to get worse, of course, now, because there are there are specific keywords that aren't going to get funded anymore. So it's going to be much more overtly partisan and much more overtly dangerous. But I would argue this has been happening for a long time.
all I can do is add, well, actually, I can't add anything to what Sarah's just said. I just want to endorse it. She said it all.
all right, fantastic. Martin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so my work at Michigan State University has actually been directly affected by this and the US government. We had a grant withdrawn from the NEH, and we've had a contract for an open access repository that we were providing to them cancelled because they're not going to be doing any research anymore to be going into an open access repository. So it absolutely is happening already that there's a specific selection of research that has been targeted for cancellation. And you can say science isn't cancelled, perhaps the humanities are, because that humanities funding agency has been absolutely gutted and transformed into a nationalist, celebrationist institution for funding American history that presents a very positive view of American history rather than a critical one. So I am quite worried, and I'm very worried about the health side of things as well in the US, and the cancellation of mRNA vaccine research, for instance, which was life-saving for me during the COVID height. So yes, that's another reason I'm not particularly optimistic.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I think that brings us to time. So I would just like to thank our three wonderful speakers, Sara, Rouhi, Martin Polyeve, and Francis Pinter, for their exceptional contributions to this topic. And I would just like to say in conclusion that although these are dark times and there are many reasons for pessimism around, let us not lose sight of the initial aims and hopes of open research and open data, and keep in mind some of the grounds of optimism that were expressed in the discussion as well. Even though it might be hard to see how those could perhaps be realized immediately, let's not give up the good fight for what we initially hoped to be possible with open research. So let me ask the audience to thank our three speakers, and thanks to all of the audience members for attending. It's been a pleasure to share this. Remember to look for the release of the recording online if you'd like to see it again. And thanks very much to all of the organizers at the LSE who helped to make this possible as well. So thank you to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Until next time.